My name is Mamta Murthy, and I'm the Vice President for Human Development here at the World Bank. I'm delighted to welcome you to this first plenary of our first ever World Bank Group Gender Learning Week. This morning, we will hear stories of bold leadership by women and innovative approaches that they have taken throughout their lives and during the COVID-19 crisis, as well as insights that they are going to bring about a future reimagined. The large number of colleagues that are connected here today reflect the World Bank Group's deep commitment to gender equality. We know that this is critical for all economies to achieve their potential and meet the challenges of the 21st century. Now, as we know, we are currently confronting a challenge of historic proportions. The COVID-19 pandemic is intensifying the adverse effects of pre-existing gender gaps. And the havoc, if I may call it that it has wreaked runs the danger of reversing the gains that have painstakingly been made over the decades, whether we're looking at health or education or jobs or entrepreneurship or voice or agency. In fact, when I think about it, the effect of the pandemic is forcing us to reconsider how we do business. And the women here today, I'm very happy to say, are leading the way with examples of how we can do things differently and what a smart recovery would look like, a recovery that helps to build further the equality between men and women. And we will hear from them on some of the priority actions that could be taken to create good jobs and good entrepreneurship opportunities for both men and women, and for making government services more inclusive. So with that, let me say no more, because we want to hear from all these illustrious women. I'm very pleased to welcome Zain Asher from CNN International, who will moderate the session. Zain needs no introduction, so I'm not going to say anything further and hand it over to her to get us started with our first plenary. Over to you, Zain.
Oh, thank you so much, Manta. Thank you so much for really summing up some of the things you want to achieve this week. As Manta mentioned, I'm an anchor at CNN International. Really excited to be part of this discussion to kick off Gender Learning Week. And this is all about leading through change. It's all about prioritizing gender equality, just given some of the economic and structural changes and challenges, more importantly, that the world is experiencing right now. So to kick off, I'm really excited to speak to Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, former finance minister of Nigeria, as well as AU special envoy to mobilize international financial support in the fight against COVID-19. Ngozi, thank you so much for being with us. If you could unmute yourself, Ngozi, that would be great. It's at the bottom of your screen.
Wonderful. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, Zain, thanks.
Thank you. So people initially talked about COVID-19 as being the great equalizer. You know, everyone sort of said, this is a virus that can affect Black, white, rich, poor. It doesn't matter your background, you're equally susceptible. And yes, while that is true, it certainly doesn't impact everybody equally. This virus has not only revealed some of the deep socioeconomic inequalities in our society, but it's also worsened and exacerbated them. What do you think are the long-term consequences of that?
Well, thank you very much, Zain. I think this is a good place to start. We've seen indeed just what you said, that even though COVID is a pandemic that has hit the whole world, it certainly is not impacting all parts of the population within countries, or, you know, impacting different countries the same. And this is where we think about the gender aspects and about women. And there are three things that have worried me in my chair in my role as the chair of Gavi, which I just left 3 weeks ago as AU and WHO envoy. I think about three gaps with respect to women. The first one is what I call the safeguarding and protecting lives gap. And what is this? I worry about women's access to protective equipment, to life-saving vaccines. We know that among healthcare workers, women predominate. I'll just give one or two numbers to illustrate. According to WHO statistics, women, there are 28 million nurses in the world, and women make up 90% of this population globally. On the African continent is 76%. With respect to doctors, women make up 40% globally and 28% on the African continent. And so we know that when it comes to access, women often don't have the same kind of level playing field to get access to what they need. So I worry so much. Are they getting access to the PPEs and all the life-saving equipment? Is anyone tracking this? Are they going to get access to vaccines? We're in the middle of trying to improve the supply of vaccines now to make sure they reach developing countries and poor and rich alike. But what happens when these vaccines actually get to a country? Do they get it? What worries me is that nobody is actually tracking, as far as I know, what is happening with respect to access. It's all very new, but I think this is something that needs to be looked at to make sure there's no differential access. That's the first gap. I think the second gap that I worry about is the economic inequality gap. This is particularly with respect to developing countries, but even here, in rich countries, you have seen in the United States, for example, how women and those at the bottom end of the ladder have been impacted so much by the economic effects of this pandemic. The lockdowns and the closures have thrown many people out of work. You know that in developing countries, most women are in the informal sector, particularly in the urban slums and urban areas. They work on a daily basis. They go to market to sell. When you have lockdowns, when you have all these barriers to the economy, when the economy is down, they suffer because they cannot earn on a daily basis. And so I really do worry about that gap. What is happening to the women? And you know that in many of our countries, we don't have the fiscal space to put forward good social safety net programs. I'll just tell you, on the African continent, the fiscal stimulus averages 2 to 3% of GDP compared to the rich countries where it's 8 to 10%. In fact, in some countries, it's 20% of GDP. So that worries me. What's happening to the women and their children? You see people here in the rich countries queuing for food at food banks, let alone in our countries, say on the African continent. So that issue of limited fiscal space to deal with this problem worries me a lot. The third gap that I want to talk about is the gender violence gap. We all know that in difficult times, there's stress within the home environment. And many of us, people who are working at home, many women, those who stay at home suffer. And we have some statistics, some surveys that have been done, some research shows there's a 42% increase in gender-based violence in Africa. In Europe, it's 31%, and in the US, it's 30%. In Nigeria, we had a survey done. In my own country, it's actually less, 18% increase, but 25% in the Northeast, where there's a lot of fragility. So what I'm trying to say is, look, the statistics show that there's a big issue here that has to be dealt with. So between those three gaps, I think we really need to be on our toes with respect to the gender aspects of what's happening in this. And I challenge the World Bank to help us with tracking some of what is happening. Munta, I'm talking to you and your colleagues, tracking information, trying to let us get the statistics on what's happening in those three gaps.
That is just what you said about gender violence is so scary, because as you were saying it, I was thinking, you talked about Nigeria, 18% overall, over 30% in the Northeast. Those are the numbers that are even reported, let alone the ones that aren't even reported, because women end up spending more time with their abusers during times of lockdown. You also touched on the fact that in Africa, we don't necessarily have the same stimulus, same safety nets as they do in the West. So my question to you now is really about solutions. So for women, just given the dire straits that a lot of women are in the continent, how do you go about building more economic resilience from this point forward, especially as the vaccine rollouts happen, so that women are better protected from this point on?
Well, I think we first, let me touch on the economic side and maybe then touch on something that I had some experience with, which I think we can build on. Women will not get particular attention unless you make it so. And this was a realization that came to me when I was finance minister. We talked a lot about gender mainstreaming, and suddenly one day as finance minister, the second time around, by the way, the first time I hadn't done as much, but the second time I realized I had some power in my hands, financial power to make things happen differently for women. And I think that's what we need to think about during this pandemic. I created a program with the help of my colleagues in which we incentivized other cabinet ministers to try to produce results beyond and above what they would have done for women within their sector in order to have a better impact on women's lives. And we started with a small program, $25 million. And I said to colleagues in cabinet, with the total support of the president, who was very gender friendly, if we can look at your program and you can show me how you would produce more results of good impact to women, we will transfer additional budget to help you scale up the program, to help you do more. And about 6 ministries volunteered to do this: Ministry of Works, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture. And so we put aside just a small amount, 25 million, and we were able to incentivize actions that were beneficial to girls and women within these ministries. To give you a couple of things that impacted. For women in agriculture, we were trying to do, the Minister of Agriculture then, Akin Adesina, was doing a program on electronic wallets to allow women, farmers, access to improved seeds and fertilizer through this electronic wallet where they could purchase right near their homes from local dealers. But women were not being included in as much numbers. With this incentive, we were able to include 2 million more women farmers who had access, and they were able to produce more. So we need so that's one. On the health side, we have this problem, the fistula, from young girls who give birth too early, and then they have this condition that is really terrible. And we were able to incentivize them to do 3,000 more repairs of these girls that change their lives around completely. This is just giving a couple of examples because we don't have time. But what I'm trying to say is, during this pandemic, we need to get out of the box and think really creatively and say, what can we do where we are, using the tools and means we are, to incentivize, the improvement in the lives of girls and women. And if you're in the finance ministry and you're a female minister, you can do more. A male minister, you can do more. Wherever you are, you just need to think a bit out of the box, because the pandemic is really hitting so much, having so much of a detrimental impact on the lives of those at the bottom end of the ladder. Many of them are women.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that anyone who is in any kind of Ministry of Finance across the continent can learn a lot from that, especially what you were saying. I mean, luckily, gender, it is important to definitely incentivize in the way you had. So I think people can learn a lot from that. Going forward, though, just because, you talked about women on the continent a lot of them being in the informal sector, therefore they're suffering disproportionate. How governments go forward, balancing, keeping everyone safe, implementing lockdowns, ensure their populations are protected from the pandemic, but also making sure that their economies stay afloat. It's a very difficult thing to balance. I mean, gender aside, for everybody in the population.
Well, it is difficult to balance, but what we're learning is that, at least let me use the continent as an example. is that there are differential impacts. We've talked about differential impacts on different parts of the population, but also geographically, we have noticed there are differential impacts. Again, if you take Nigeria as an example, you will learn that in many of the rural areas, the impact of COVID, and in some states, it's not as difficult or as bad as others. I'm not saying this meaning that those states should be complacent. No, they should still respect all the rules to protect people. But we see that in the urban areas, there's a really serious problem of spikes, and the impact is heavy. So the thing is, differentially, what some of the recommendations have been is in those states and in those areas where it is not as bad, you don't have to have a national kind of edict. You can change it so that where the impact is not so bad, you allow economic activities to continue and to that the way they normally would, and then other areas where the impact is very severe, you take strong measures to make sure that whether it's complete lockdown, partial lockdown, whatever the case may be, that you take those measures to keep people safe. And so that's one of the ways that governments can look at this. What's actually happening inside the country? What are the differential impacts on different parts of the country? That's one. Two, in looking at how you come out of COVID, you have to look at your population and make very good choices about who gets to the vaccines first. Of course, frontline workers, I think that's a sine qua non. But after that, how do you approach your population, to make sure that this feeds into the ability to come, sort of revive your economy quickly and get people back to work. So I think that it requires creativity, it requires innovation, and it requires looking at the facts and the science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely not a one, as you were saying earlier, it's not a one size fits all. You have to look at the different parts of your population, who is suffering economically more, and tailor make the response to suit them. My final question to you is, obviously, because we are both Nigerian, I do want to ask you this. Nigeria clearly, producer of oil, has relied on oil for has reaped the rewards of being an oil producing country, for sure. But that's a massive problem when oil prices suddenly crash and countries are not prepared for it. When oil prices crashed, Nigerians pivoted, or tried to pivot, I should say, towards a much more self-sufficient, made in Nigeria approach. I remember going back to Lagos and everybody talking about made in Nigeria, made in Nigeria. Now, it's debatable whether or not that was effective, whether or not that ended up materializing in the way it should have, but at least there was an attempt to say, what can we learn from this crisis? What can we learn from oil prices crashing and us not being ready for it? In this pandemic, is there a way for us as a continent to really learn from it and to say that the continent of Africa is going to reinvent the way it does business going forward after having learned from this massive out of the blue economic shock? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, I do think, Zain, that there are things we can learn in Africa, but all over the world. I think we must learn them the proper way, right? The right lessons. What we saw during the pandemic is that people began to see that some of the supply chains for key products they consume were, impacted. For example, for medical products, I don't think people had really given it thought before. But when countries started to put export prohibitions on masks and gloves and PPEs, and then now we see vaccine nationalism in some cases taking place, people have begun to think, wow, how do I in future deal with this? Now we've got trade. And so trade has enabled us eventually to let people see that vaccine nationalism or just protecting your own population does not work in this pandemic, because you'll never be safe until everyone is safe. So, it makes sense to have trade rules that allow goods to move. But at the same time, it has shown us that maybe we need to think more smartly about some essential things that we consume. Let me just take the pharmaceuticals, therapeutics, diagnostics, and even vaccines at the end of the day. On the continent, the Economic Commission for Africa has put forward statistics that we import more than 90% of the pharmaceuticals we consume on the continent, 90%. That is amazing. It's South Africa and Nigeria produce some, and little bits and pieces in other countries. But that's an amazing statistics. So one thing to learn from here is, what do we now do? And I think the country should think about it. We need, obviously, to look at a pharmaceutical industry that takes more roots, so we are not so dependent. That would also create good manufacturing jobs in pharmaceuticals on the continent. Now we have the African Continental Free Trade Area that gives us a market of 1.3 billion consumers. How can we establish an industry that can now, with freer borders, serve that big population? So that's a good lesson to learn, that we don't have to import everything. We can manufacture some of those things on the continent. Similarly, food. One of the sectors that has been a bit resilient is agriculture. How do we incentivize people so we can produce more and not have to depend on importing? We still import. We spend billions of dollars on the continent, still importing lots of food items. And this has shown us, look, we can't produce more. We should focus on how to incentivize production, particularly for women. Most of our food on the continent is produced by women. How do we get seeds, fertilizers, and what is needed into their hands so that they can help us be more self-sufficient in some of the vital products?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have definitely learned, I think across the world, not just Africa, but across the world, we've learned that supply chains are not as dependable or are not as resilient as you might think, especially when there's a massive economic shock like a pandemic, like a virus. And so, but with that though, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, thank you so much for giving us your time today. I think that everyone who's listened to this has learned so much from your wisdom, and good luck with the road ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zane. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Okay, moving forward, I would like to introduce our next panel, a panel of three incredible women leaders who are going to talk to us, just basically sort of continuing the themes of what Ngozi talked about, righting the wrongs of gender inequality in their respective industries, and also bold examples of their own leadership as well. And after that, we're going to open the floor to audience questions. So I'd like to introduce our panel. We can see one of them already, Shivani Sachdeva, founder and managing director and CEO of India Alternatives, which is a private equity fund, one of the few women-led firms in the region. Thank you so much. And I can see Rana as well. Rana is the CEO of Affectiva in Egypt, which is a software company that builds artificial intelligence. And I don't know if we can, I know we can hear Jokate. I'm not sure if we can actually see her. Jokate, can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you see me now?
I can't see you, but I can hear you, which is almost as good. If you're having internet problems, I think it's fine if you
I can see you perfectly.
Perfect. Okay. So Jokate Mwegelo is district commissioner for Kisarawe in Tanzania, which is just west of the Dar es Salaam region, and she manages a population of 112,000 people. So all of these women bring very diverse perspectives to the conversation for Gender Learning Week. I do want to start off with Shivani, with you, because you run one of the few women-led private equity firms in the region. I just think you have a really good perspective when it comes to managerial role for women, and also the responsibility that women in these kinds of positions have. I mean, you heard Ngozi talking about just the fact that she was a female finance minister. She had a massive responsibility and also ability to actually affect change for women, as do you. So my first question to you is, how do you incorporate a gender lens when it comes to your investing themes?
Thanks, Zane. That needs to be
Actually, Shivani, your internet is
Yes. Yes.
Shivani, I'm sorry. Internet is cutting out a bit. I can, but if it happens again, I think that you should try taking off your video and then doing it again. But let's try again. You can start again.
Okay. So one of the biggest myths that need to be busted, how's that now? Is it better?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Is that women are insignificant as customers. Okay. And in fact, we believe that women are the world's largest target market. And even today, this market is so poorly understood. In fact, in one of the IFC reports, which I'm sure many of us, around this table have read, they talk about misconceptions in offering and designing products for women. So, of course, when you think about designing a product for a woman, and this example was interesting. They said, well, why can't we just make a pink credit card, for example, right? So it's a very male lens for this huge segment of the population that demands something very different, something unique, and wants to feel great. Okay? And what do we do at India Alternatives? According to our own internal estimates, based on reports from RBI, World Bank, and BCG, we believe women control 60 to 80% of consumption decisions, making them one of the largest markets with the potential of something like $980 billion. So if we're not servicing this market correctly, obviously we are doing a very big injustice to women. The way and what we've seen on the ground here is that the urban middle class Indian woman is going through a very dramatic change where she is now prioritizing herself in the consumption hierarchy. So let's say if you looked at the way she thought about spending a decade ago, and if this woman had discretionary income, she would prioritize spending it on her husband, her children, her in-laws. In fact, she came very low in the pecking order of her own spend, which is interesting. And I think the development and the change that we've seen on the ground, Zain, over the last decade, is that this woman is now ready to spend on herself. So anecdotally, one of our investments in our first fund was in a lingerie company, and when we invested, we found that it was a very, very male lens in terms of connecting with the woman customer, and the brand and message of the company was transform yourself. And we said, well, that is not exact. That's not what we want to tell our urban middle class Indian woman who's now beginning to feel empowered, right? And we hired a consultant to go interview women in the larger cities in India, in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, and they came back and said a lot of Indian women, urban middle class Indian women, are feeling better, and they want to feel better. I think that's the important part, right? They want to feel better, they want to feel more empowered, and this message is not connecting. So we reoriented, we pivoted the brand of the company to a much more woman-centric and woman-friendly message. So we moved it from transform yourself to fabulous as I am. So I think this is just one example of incorporating that gender lens in the way that we invest.
Yeah, that's actually fascinating, especially when you were talking about women being much more ready to spend on themselves, and just this idea that women are not insignificant as customers. They're much more significant than I think a lot of male-led private equity funds would think they are. So what would you say are the long-term consequences, just given your unique perspective as a woman who leads a private equity fund, and obviously you've been able to use your sphere of influence to implement change? What are the long-term consequences to the other side of that? When you have an underrepresentation of women in leadership roles, particularly in private equity, what would you say are the consequences of that? And if I could just ask you to keep your answers relatively short so that everyone has to respond, that'd be great.
Absolutely, I'll be brief, but I think if I were to answer that in one word, I think the long-term consequences would be tragic. In fact, we see that in India today, and it was interesting to hear Nicole talk about women doctors. And I think she said something like that 40% of doctors, are women, and are lower in India, but on a relative standpoint, the percentage of the representation in fund management is abysmally low even today, right? And if that continues over the long run, I think the biggest consequence of that will be that women will not be adequate recipients of capital, because there's enough studies out there that show a correlation between allocation and receipt of capital. So if you just have more and more male run private equity funds, the consequences will range from not understanding the largest target market of women, not being able to sell or to create products that women demand, and then also much more severe, equally severe consequences of not having adequate capital for women recipients. So I think those two sort of go hand in hand. So I think those would be the long-term consequences of not having more women being represented in fund management.
All right, thank you. I want to turn now to Rana El Kulibi. So Rana, you wrote a book called Girl Decoded, and I think I absolutely love the concept, and I think I really want everyone to sort of hear what it's about, because the book documents your journey as, what has been referred to as like your journey as a nice Egyptian girl to actually becoming a woman and revolutionizing technology on the way. So, why did you write the book? And for women out there who are reading this book or who plan to read this book, what do you hope they take away from it?
Thank you, Zain, and hi, everybody. So I'm an Egyptian American scientist turned entrepreneur. I grew up in the Middle East as a nice Egyptian girl, as you said, Zain, and then found myself, I studied computer science for my PhD, and found myself in Boston, where I am right now, challenged with this opportunity to start a company in the tech and the artificial intelligence space. And I remember we're 10 years into the company, but when we first spun out of MIT, I was, I did the whole Sand Hill Roadshow to raise money for the company. And it hit me that we met zero female investors. We were always pitching to older white guys, basically. There wasn't a lot of diversity. And building on Shakib's point, that kind of bias in the whole tech ecosystem manifests in a number of ways. It manifests in the amount of dollars that go into funding female founders. It goes into the percent of wealthy women who have, capital to invest further and support female founded businesses. And also it introduces bias in how we build AI. So anyways, I wrote the book called Girl Decoded. It's a memoir. It follows my personal journey becoming a CEO of a tech company, and also the journey of the technology. I'm in the business of building emotional intelligence into technology, which is, again, it was started by a group of female scientists, because we acknowledged that the way we think about technology and AI is very cognitively based, and we don't consider empathy in how we think about tech. And so we've been calling for this idea of humanizing technology for the past 20 years or so. So I think we have a lot of work to do around the technology ecosystem, and the pandemic hasn't really helped.
No, absolutely not. So thank you for that summary for your book. When you look at the tech landscape, be it in Silicon Valley or elsewhere, naturally, we all know that the gender gaps in technology are pretty severe, and they are far and widespread. They need to change. So it's one thing for technology companies, startups in Silicon Valley to talk about, yes, this is something that is a priority, better representation of minorities, better representation of women. And it's another thing to actually implement real concrete change. So what do you think the tech firms have done right overall? What do you think they need to do better in order to make sure that what they say is a priority, i.e. better gender representation, actually becomes a reality?
Yeah, I think we have to be intentional about it. So it's not just going to happen by accident, even if the talent is out there. And I do believe that the talent is out there. I think as a company, as an organization, you have to really prioritize that, and you have to quantify, you have to measure it, you have to advocate for it. So for me, I'm part of an organization called Always. It is a nonprofit that supports both female founders and female funders. And we created an incredible community over the past number of years. And there's a lot of programming. One of the things that came out of Always, which I'm very proud of, this idea of a panel where it's a panel of just men. It's very, very common in the tech industry, unfortunately, still. And so we're trying to combat the mantle, and we've created this Visionary Voices. It's the speaking bureau for women in technology, and we try to support each other. I will not get on a panel anymore where I'm the only woman. I always challenge the organizers to do better, and also try to think about people of color too. So that's really important. So I think we just have to be intentional about it. And it's unfortunately across the entire ecosystem. We need more female founders. I mean, I was just looking at the latest statistics. Only 4% of venture funding over the last year went to female founded businesses. And less than 10% of investors are women, right? We need to, I think these numbers are US focused, but I'm sure it's similar worldwide. So we need more female founders, more female investors. We need more female board members, right? And just more representation across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And actually what you were saying about the manels had me thinking, because, I mean, obviously as a woman, it's great that you can stand up and say, I'm not going to participate in an all-male panel. And I know other women who say that too. However, I think that actually there's now been the sea change where I'm hearing of more men saying that they will not participate in all male panels, which I think is phenomenal, because yes, we have a situation where, yes, both of you as women in your respective fields can naturally implement changes in your companies because you're at the top of your companies, but also men can too, even if they might not see it as part of their sphere of influence. They can actually make changes too. Men deciding not to sit on all male panels, I think, is definitely a step in the right direction. I do want to bring up Jokate with a few minutes we have left. So, Jokate, you're obviously, I know that you can't, okay, we can't see you, but we can hear you, which I think is almost as good. So,
hey, it's weird because I can see you all.
Okay, great. Okay. So, you're obviously extremely young and you're female, you're a district commissioner in Tanzania. Where do you think that Tanzania has made progress when it comes to gender equality, and where do you think that some of the gaps still remain?
Well, I think we've definitely made tremendous progress when it comes to girls' access to primary and secondary education, women's representation in decision-making spaces. I'll just set an example here. When you look between the years 2010 to 2011, throughout 2014, 2015, we've seen the proportion of women in senior positions increase from 33% to 41%. And we've also seen improved access to employment in sectors such as manufacturing, trade, hotels, food services. And also we've seen, just set a tone, we've had the first female vice president back in 2015. We've had the first speaker of parliament. We've had the first female finance minister. We've had a lot of firsts in the country, which has set a tone, which has also given women a room to show their talent in leadership, and it also acts as inspiration for young girls across the country. Hello?
I'm trying to unmute myself. I'm sorry. So those are the sort of strides that Tanzania has made. But where do you see some of the gaps?
Well, the biggest, to be honest, we've done tremendous work when it comes to legal and institutional framework. But the biggest hurdle that I see is definitely gender norms, culture, and social and economic inequalities. We still live in a society where culture still doesn't really truly believe a woman can hold certain senior positions. They accept it because of the legal frameworks and what is needed to be done. But deep down, we still have to break these gender norms and cultures, and that's what we're still trying to do. But I really see there's a greater future for women to do much better in the very near future, as we've seen progress throughout the years.
And Mike, I'm going to ask you one more before we go back to hopefully have time to talk to Rana and Shivani again. But one more is, cultural shifts are very difficult to change. I mean, they're deep, they go back centuries. I mean, it's a difficult question, I understand that, but how do you think we can sort of begin to dismantle some of those cultural views about what a woman's place is in society in a place like Tanzania?
What I commend, what I definitely commend, we've seen, for example, political parties, we've seen institutions really be really sensitive on making sure there's like equality, like women are employed, women are seen, women are heard, which is great. For example, with the role that I've been given, I'm not the only female district commissioner in the country. I was appointed together with a number of other female leaders to these positions. And this just goes to send a message that women are important. We have a space in our communities. And once we are given a chance, we can truly showcase the power we have and what we can do for our societies. And once upon we get this power, now it's up to us to and enabling fellow women, and especially younger women, the upcoming generations, to see value in themselves through us, because we mirror what we anticipate these girls to become in the near future. So it's great. It's really important for us to continue to be role models and to continue to come up, show up, and really enable our communities to say, okay, wow, we have women leaders. They can actually do it. They can actually get things done. And once they see these examples in real time, then it's a precedence of a different mental and perspective on what women leadership can actually do for our societies. And in turn, they become more receptive of women in different positions. So it's much of a burden, because whenever you get a position, people expect you to not perform. So so we have to work extra hard to prove that we can actually do a great job, and most times we do a great job even than more men in similar positions.
Can I build on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I do think representation really matters. Once you see somebody you can kind of resonate with, and you can look up to a woman and say, oh, if she's done it, I can do that too. I think that's really powerful. In the United States, of course, we've just sworn in our first ever Indian African-American Vice President, Kamala Harris. And, you know, we can't say anymore that we've never had a woman vice president. That glass ceiling has been broken. And I think that's super powerful. It's an incredibly powerful message to the world.
I'm sorry, I'm going to unmute myself. Absolutely. Representation is really important, just for the inspirational element of it as well. But also what Jakate said, you know, just to even have access to the table, just to even get a seat on the table, you have to be better. And that is something that I think hopefully I pray will eventually change with time. Shivani, my final question is going to go to you, but if you could keep it very brief, I would sincerely appreciate it. Is how do you make sure that female entrepreneurs have equal access to capital? Because I think that's really important when it comes to building more female entrepreneurs in society and leveling the economic playing field overall.
I think that's a brilliant question, Zain, and I'm going to echo a little bit. Representation being I think the biggest issue Anna mentioned, less than 10% of investors are women in the US. That number is obviously lower in India. It's 8% in India, which is drastically low. So I think getting out there, shattering in fund management, like in technology, there are very deeply that women aren't cut out for management. It's very alpha type of a business, cutthroat. It's a whole narrative of barbarians at the gate, what have you. But the reality is that it's much more of a long-term business, which is relationship oriented. So Zain, to try to keep it brief here, the point is representation, being vocal. I think if you are vocal, we all have responsibility in our positions. So getting out there, shattering myths, being vocal, maybe speaking to women, but as this takes a while, in the interim, other things, one of the things that we are doing is proactively trying to host sessions with women entrepreneurs and telling them how to equip themselves. Oftentimes we find that women entrepreneurs want a certain level of perfection before they go out and fundraise vis-a-vis their male counterparts. So equipping them with that, those are just some of the suggestions. But I'll keep it brief, and I totally resonate with both Rana and Zukate in terms of representation, shattering myths, and just being vocal, being visible.
Thank you so much, Shivani. Thank you, Rana. Thank you, Jokati. I want to turn now to audience questions. So I'm going to just read what some of them are. I'm going to start with this question for Rana. And you may have touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can expand. It's from Joseph Lazier. Joseph, thank you so much for your question. What have been the hindrances to women's leadership globally? Rana, obviously, you were talking about just having our first female vice president in the United States. And obviously, for a westernized country, that's quite surprising. You know, in the UK, we had Margaret Thatcher back in 1979 to 1990. So what have been some of the hindrances you think in this country and beyond for that sort of thing to take this long?
I think it's what you said, right? Culture, like some of these things are so deeply ingrained in our cultures that it takes years and years to change it. I do think, especially in technology, right? As I think about how technology has become mainstream and artificial intelligence in particular is becoming mainstream. I think it's so important to recognize that if we don't include diverse voices as we're designing these technologies, it is going to result in very biased systems and solutions that are just going to exasperate kind of the biases we see in the world today. So I think some of it is perpetual. I don't know. I feel like it needs a lot of courage. So a lot of people who are willing to take a risk on you. That's a hard question. I mean, I grew up in the Middle East, where again, there's a lot of cultural norms that as a woman I had to abide to, but I found something I'm very passionate about, which is technology. And I kind of, I was willing to take a risk and challenge these norms. And it took a while to not feel guilty about that, right? And feel that I kind of failed my parents. I'm a divorced woman. It took years for my parents to kind of share that within their social network. So I think there's a lot of these, cultural norms that we have to break free of.
Just so hard to dismantle. I have a great question. I think I'm going to ask this to Shivani. I wish I knew who asked this so I could thank them. I don't think I have. Let's see. I don't think I have the name of who asked this, but whoever sent this, thank you so much. So somebody's asking, how can they make a difference in the lives of women in their own job? They're an executive director. They don't say where they're an executive director at, which is, I think, quite important. But I think overall, just as a leader of a company, and they go on to say, International Women's Day is approaching. What can I do differently in my service to the lives of women and young girls? I think that's a brilliant question. I'm going to ask to Shivani. And thank you, whoever asked that question. It's a great question.
It's an amazing question, Zain. Do we know if it was a male or a female who asked that question?
I don't know. And I don't want to guess, because I don't want to, I don't want to say, but it doesn't say at all. If one of the organizers could message me who asked that question in the chat, that would be great. But if not, that's totally fine. Shivani, if you could answer.
Yeah, that's fine. So I think what you can do, whoever asked that brilliant question, what you can do is go out, shatter preconceived notions. I think women, it sounds like from listening to Rana, from listening to Jukati, and this entire is coming out, is that there are systemic across every field. So the first thing you can do is shatter preconceived notions, be vocal, represent, and doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Lots of interesting ideas have come out, but shatter the preconceived norms. men are not necessarily better at technology. Men are not necessarily better at fund management. And in fact, there's countless studies that show gender balance across all of these has positive results. So be a steward. I would say be vocal, because we need to shake things up a little bit right now. We can't just look at the status quo and hope for things to change. And while we're in the midst of this change, we'll have to be much more vocal, be much more proactive. So what I would say is be vocal, be visible about this. And we need you. If you're at the top of your company, we need you.
Yeah, and also, mentoring as well, I think is really important. I think that, it's breaking free of that. There can only be one. If there's a woman in a particular role, there can only be one. And, I'm not going to take this other woman because what if that jeopardizes my role? You've got to sort of very not competitive. It's getting rid of that competitive mindset where I think as women, if to be perfectly honest with you, we can sometimes compete against other women, and just sort of dismantling that notion and knowing that there's room for more than one woman at the table. And I think understanding that, you will mentor, you'll be much more generous with your time, and you will use your sphere of influence to help other women in a much more productive way. So that question, I'm told, came from Liberia, but we're not sure who that person is. I do have another question for Jokate. Jokate, how did you innovate as a district commissioner? How did you make it? How did you innovate while you were in that role?
Well, I think how I got to this role, I've definitely gone in school. I've been very vocal and very engaged at a very tender age. I've held a number of leadership positions. I've done quite a number of works with regards to enabling conducive environments for women, let's say young girls with disabilities, to get sports facilities. So I've been actively involved, and I got into active politics. That's when I got the appointment. Now, upon getting the appointment, I think what I've managed to do with my role is really approach it with aspiration and inspiration, but at the same time partner with different people, because we have limited resources. Because I lead a district that is really poor in the region that I'm at, so I really need to collaborate and partner with different stakeholders within and outside government. But the thing that I would say that we managed to actually do is build our first girls boarding school, which was pretty innovative, because it enabled us to, as I said it previously, representation matters. Most girls from here really don't make it to high school, and they don't make it to university. So being able to build a first girls boarding school that goes up to high school gives girls perspective of what they can achieve once they get into school. So that was pretty innovative, because nothing of that nature has been done by any district commissioner or any leader in my space, and it has really enabled us to change perspective in a district where it is dominantly Muslims of the coast who really don't see girls as a priority. So for us to put girls as on top of our agenda really enabled us to give confidence to these young girls to want to excel, to want to actually go to school, and once in school, want to excel in school and want to pursue further education. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Shakati, for that question. I want to give the final question before we run out of time to Rana. Albert Kikwenga, thank you, Albert, is asking, what are some of the stereotypes that you had to surmount while trying to lead the way for change?
Thank you, Zain. Thank you, Albert, for the question. A few. First of all, that women do not necessarily can be leaders in technology and can be CEOs of really kind of state-of-the-art companies that are pushing the boundaries of what technology can look like and be like. Definitely coming from the Middle East, this idea of, I started my PhD program while I was newly married, and that meant I had to, kind of leave my country, and I moved to the United Kingdom to do my PhD there, and that was pretty kind of pushing the boundaries. And then once again, I did that again when I moved to Boston with 2 young kids as a divorced and single mom. I remember my dad and almost everybody in my family saying, you're going to fail, like you're going to be miserable, you can't do this alone. So I think, again, back to having faith and having courage and supporting yourself with people who really believe in you, that was really key. And paying it forward. Zain, I liked what you said about mentorship and just being grateful for the support we're each getting, but knowing that we also have a responsibility to pay it forward. And that gives me a lot of ammo, actually. I find that it helps me back.
No, absolutely. And we have run out of time, but Shivani, Jakate, Rane, thank you so much for your inspiration and imagination. I think that, the audience will agree with me that we've learned so much, especially about the importance of representation, not just with women leading, but also men can do a lot. Men do have a lot of power here. And just because it might not necessarily affect them in the same way, that doesn't mean that they can't implement changes too. And also, I think the biggest takeaway here is just how hard it is to dismantle preconceived stereotypes when it comes to what a woman's role is. Particularly in some of the countries that the 3 of you represent, but also here in the United States. It's taken us a very long time to have a female vice president. So we've learned an enormous amount. The learning does continue with the World Bank Group through Gender Learning Week, and I hope everyone in the audience can make use of all the exciting sessions that is on the roster to help us build a much more equal world for all. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you to our panelists, and stay safe and happy 2021. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Zain, thanks a lot. That was brilliantly done. Thank you.